Pajashig, welcome. Welcome to InDigital Insights. Monique Manatch Indigenous, Kitikanik Anishinabek and Dojiba. My name is Monique Manatch, and I'm a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And today, we have the wonderful opportunity to be able to speak with Steven Loft. Now, Steve, you're Gahangayaga.
Kanyangahaga, yeah. My home community is the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm Turtle Clan, and I now have the honor and privilege of living and working on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And in my basement, which is located on that beautiful territory.
You've had such a varied and wonderful career.
I like to think so. Others might disagree, but yeah, no, I've been in the sector for 30 plus years now, and so yeah, it's allowed me to work for, I hope, our people as we assert our voice and presence in the cultural sector of this land.
So you started in Hamilton at the Native Indian Inuit Photographers Association. And where did you go from there?
Oh my goodness! Well, it was a journey. I did indeed start at NEPA, the Native Indian Inuit Photographers Association, which was the first recognized Indigenous artist-run center in the country. It was an amazing opportunity for me. I started there when they started their video art program, and spent many years there learning that and practicing. I'm very proud to say I made some interesting things, but not being a very good or prolific artist, I decided that probably wasn't my career path. So I started to think more about the criticality around Indigenous artwork at that time, which was the early 90s, and about curating and the discourse that surrounded Indigenous art at that time. NEPA had a gallery, so I started curating work there and getting in touch with other Indigenous curators and artists while we were doing that work to really understand better how we placed ourselves in an art historical paradigm, how that had been done in the past, and how the new thinking around it was being approached by many people. So that was a really formative time for me. Became the artistic director there. That gave me the opportunity to work with many amazing artists and work on a lot of great projects. From there, I went to the Art Gallery of Hamilton, where I was their first Indigenous curator, working under the fabulous Shirley Medill, who was one of the first curators, non-Indigenous curators on this land to really really begin to bring the voices and artistic expressions of Indigenous people into a wider presentation when she'd worked at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and then brought that thinking to the Art Gallery of Hamilton as well. So I was really excited. That was also was a great time for me. It allowed me to really explore the ongoing discourse around Indigenous art, but also be part of a movement towards authoring and bringing agency and authority to Indigenous voice when it comes to art and culture. And I think that was a really important movement. I was very lucky to be colleagues with other Indigenous art professionals at the time who were really pushing those kinds of boundaries and working to bring those perspectives to the fore. So that was wonderful. Then I had the opportunity to go to Winnipeg and was offered the position of the director of the Urban Shaman Gallery in Winnipeg, which was one of the newer at the time Indigenous artist-run centers. And spent 6 years in Winnipeg running that gallery, and really was able then to center that voice and those perspectives in the work that we were doing. Winnipeg, of course, always a real cultural hub on this land, and certainly given the range and numbers of Indigenous peoples who are there and in that area, as well as the national discourses and international discourses that were taking place at that time, was able to, I think, bring a much expanded view of the expressions of Indigenous peoples from this land and others into conversation. And so that was a real shifting of the dynamics, I think, and it was happening in other places with other centers and with other galleries as well, and with other institutions and organizations. But there was really movement in ways that we hadn't seen as much in the past. And again, it was a very important time for the sector and for the community. So that was a great place for us to really be at the center of those kinds of dialogues. From there, I went to the National Gallery of Canada, where I was Indigenous curator in residence for a couple of years. And that gave me a taste of what the colonial enterprise, as it relates to art and culture on this land, was. That there was also a lot of movement happening at some of our colonial institutions, the National Gallery being one at the time. They had just formed the Indigenous Art Department at that time. And so it was an important movement there. But it also did give me a real glimpse into how the structures of our art and culture sector had formed and had become an extension of the colonial mindset, an extension of the colonial worldview, an extension of colonization. And, because it's all part and parcel of that notion, that myth of nationhood of Canada. And art and culture is a very important piece of that. And that goes back to the Massey Report, which was an incredibly important document that really outlined what the basis for art and culture and education would be on this land. And that clearly that had left us as Indigenous peoples, that's the First Peoples, out. And it was part of this myth making of the Canadian nation. And, it was developed in part because Canada was not seen as this real nation. It was always in the shadow of the United States. It had this British, obviously, colonial histories. So it was an attempt by the government of the day to really assert a Canadianness. And one of the things they did or needed to do or felt that was important was to exclude the Indigenous histories, Indigenous views. And again, that's just an extension of what had been going on for hundreds of years. But you get a really good idea of how that formed the sense of Canadian art and culture, as opposed to something more evolved, something more in keeping with a very oppressive history, albeit a history that was moving towards more recognition, more acknowledgement of Indigenous voice. So again, a kind of a pivotal time, but I learned a lot about that during that time. At that point, I went to Toronto, where I was lucky enough to be offered the position as the executive director of the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, and an amazing organization which had been from its earliest days part of that presence in a way that I think very few other organizations were. It became part of the larger presence of Indigenous voice and expression, certainly in the film and moving image world. But that had a really profound effect and continues to do so today, and have that presence. So that was again a wonderful experience for me. Then went to Toronto Metropolitan University, which is at that time still called Ryerson University, which is problematic in itself, to do a 3-year fellowship in Indigenous art and culture. So I was working with what was then called the Ryerson Image Center, which is the gallery there, as well as teaching and also pursuing some of the research projects that I'd been working on. So spent 3 years there, through a little over 3 years there. And then was lucky enough to be selected to be the first director of the Indigenous art programs, the new Indigenous art programs at the Canada Council for the Arts, where I spent about 9 years as we developed new programming. That's not to say there wasn't already what was then called Aboriginal programs, but they were not, they were situated within the colonial structure. And so our focus was on creating sovereign space within a colonial institution. And how could you do that honors the histories and acknowledges the importance of supporting Indigenous artists, arts professionals, but also the development of an Indigenous arts infrastructure, an ecosystem separate than the colonial one that already existed. So that was, I think, work that led to a lot of some good things, I hope. And we can talk about those if you want. But then my path took me a little bit down the street a bit when the National Gallery of Canada, again, was really seeking and searching out ways to better transform itself to reflect not just the realities of the nation state of Canada, but the land we live on, but also to create a new way of thinking and relating through art and culture, which was very exciting for me. So I accepted the position of Vice President, Indigenous Ways and Decolonization, to really bring that thinking to what is the largest, colonial art space on the land, and to try to think about how we might do things differently, how we might have new relationships, how we might really honor the spirit and intent of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which talks about culture, the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and also bring ourselves into a transformational phase that would move the way we think art and culture on this land in a different way that gives primacy, authority, and agency to Indigenous peoples when it comes to our art and cultures and how they intersect with other cultures that share the land. So that's where I am now.
Hey. Wow. I'm wondering because over the years, so much has changed, and I'm wondering what strikes you as our biggest our biggest change, the biggest push forward or evolution.
I think it's on a continuum. I mean, certainly the power and presence of Indigenous peoples and our seeking to have our voice and our presence as part of the larger discussion have been there forever. Um, and so it's part of a continuum and that has happened in all sectors of life. In the society, but certainly in art and culture, I mean, we can see phases of where it happened. Obviously, the Indians of Canada Pavilion and Expo 67 was a momentous moment that predated my involvement in the sector. Things like Land Spirit Power at the National Gallery and Indigena at the what is now the Canadian Museum of History in '92 were very important. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report that very much came out of the resistance at Oka, and all of the amazing artists, filmmakers, writers, musicians who had been doing this work who may not have been getting the attention they deserved. So this was all happening, for many years. But you do see points at where there's movement And I think that's, again, as we move through the 70s into the 80s, the voice is becoming a little bit more prevalent. Then after Oka, which was sort of the revolution that was televised, uh, you know, uh, there was an awareness, a much bigger awareness among the general populace, and certainly maybe at government levels, of the need to address Indigenous rights in a different way. Now, it was very flawed, of course, and very colonial in its constructs. But you do see the rise of a movement for Indigenous cultural sovereignty, and that manifests in various ways. The rise in Indigenous-led arts and cultural organizations in this sector, and again, we can talk about other sectors, but and then you start to see Indigenous artists really coming onto the Canadian and world stage in ways that you hadn't before. So there are major movements there. The first major solo exhibition of Indigenous artists at the National Gallery, at galleries across the country, the rise in the Indigenous arts infrastructure, which is really important, and then the proliferation of artists who are just getting so much attention because people hadn't seen anything like this before. And so that was really important. Then things kind of died down for a bit. Governments change, different shifts in social, the social ecosystem change, and people kind of forget. And then there are lulls, and then it comes back. And then you see, reemergence of these kinds of discussions. Not that Indigenous people weren't doing this work all through this time, but it does ebb and flow a bit. But you do see the movement starting to shift in the 90s, where what I like to say is people kicking the door in and those inside trying to open those doors. So, a combination of Indigenous people infiltrating colonial spaces. And I use that term very, purposefully, and those on the outside demanding to be let in. And I think that the combination of that starts to create change. And you get into a movement from what I would the long history of the arts and culture infrastructure on this land being the colonial status quo, which did not include us, into something more, what I would say is more a representational phase. So we see the first hirings of Indigenous people in colonial institution, the first, as we say, small gains being made, Indigenous art being acknowledged in certain ways. And again, that's an important word because it implies legitimization by the colonial structure. But that is not to say that gains weren't made. So yes, we had an Indigenous art department, of 2 people at the National Gallery of Canada. The Canada Council creates its first Aboriginal specific programs, albeit small and embedded within the larger colonial art historical paradigm. So that has its own challenges and ironies in it, but it starts to happen, and so shows start to happen. Things start to get published. Our artists and organizations start to get more money, and so this is very much a ripple effect. And so this period is important. Unfortunately, it's also very slow. So, we can look back at that and say, ooh, that, if that phase, was 25 years in the making, approximately, so, we're going then from, the late 80s, early 90s into the, 2000s, and that becomes the prevalence. So you see, one Indigenous person get hired, at a, and or 2, and being expected to kind of be all things about Indigenous people and also speak for Indigenous people and to Indigenous people and to non-Indigenous people, and to, in some ways assuage their guilt. And so that leads to a lot of burnout, a lot of issues of aggression, microaggressions, but things get done, which also is the history as we enter into these dynamics of Indigenous people as they come into and collide with and try to work with and try to activate colonial institutions in new ways. And then I think, what you start to see in the last 15 years is this movement towards self-determination and sovereignty in a much more profound way. Um, you know, by this time, Indigenous artists are winning awards, winning acclaim, are getting so well known that it's now, that genie has left the bottle. And so now the pressure's on is, well, how do we do this in a way that allows these stories to be told in the right way by the right people and respected, not acknowledged, respected, and honored. And so that, I think, brings us into the phases that we're entering into now when we're talking about decolonization in a serious way. That was never part of the dialogue back in the 80s or 90s. This is, so true reconciliation, conciliation, and decolonization become more centralized in what we're doing. And what that implies is changing the foundations, not just changing the symptomatic. So yes, we can put more funding. Yes, we can, get, a few more shows in, but that doesn't change the foundation of the sector. And that's where I think we're at now, is we're actually having, these kinds of conversations, making those kinds of effort. And of course, getting the backlash that that's going to cause, because that's threatening. And, because people don't understand what it means. So I think that's the phase we're at now, is what does this decolonization, what does that actually mean? What does it mean for our sector? What does it mean for our institutions? And where do we go with that? And so I think that, that's the continuum we're on right now.
How do you think the advent of the digital has impacted this trajectory?
Well, I think it's had a really profound effect. I mean, as it has on all sectors. You know, from something as simple, not simplistic, but as simple as the ability to communicate across much more vast time and space, and to have those connections expanded in ways that we could have never thought of it before. So on that level, it made it so much easier to get those voices, those expressions into a wider dialogue, and so that was really amazing. But on an artistic level, was also very interesting in the sense that because it was so new, we were, as Indigenous creators, um, Indigenous artists were at the forefront and starting from the same line. And so there wasn't the same kind of colonial dogmatic pressure that are in other disciplines that were the colonial disciplines. So in dance, which has this long history, but what we kind of understand as artistic dance was very much the Euro-Western model. And that's not to say that dance wasn't taking place all over the world. Of course, we know it was, but it was a very specific. And so that became the dogmatic. And so certain types of dance were those that were accepted. Others were not. And so there's a whole history that had to be just broken down. And that takes a lot. But when you're working in a newer genre art form, there wasn't that. Now, that's not to say some things weren't, it wasn't attempted that those Euro-Western dogmatic principles weren't brought to it, because that was the attempt that was made. It was like, oh, this is, even if you're doing this, it still has to conform to what, this society and, sees this as. But it's easy to break down those very outmoded conventions, and that wasn't just happening here; it was happening all over the world. And so you get a real new art form that in many ways could break down those very colonial barriers in a much quicker way. And so that's the other thing. And then again, the ability to then connect, especially for, Indigenous people here. One of our issues is this land is so vast. One of the real problems for us dating back to those early days was we just didn't get together. And so it was easy to keep our communities distant. And so there wasn't this kind of collective movement. It was happening in various places, but it was difficult to coordinate and see it as a larger movement. But when you have the ability to connect with other communities, like-minded communities, other Indigenous arts infrastructures, other Indigenous arts professionals, other Indigenous artists, all of a sudden it becomes a much more potent force. And I think I remember in the early days when we would get together, when we have conferences or symposium or opportunities to gather for major shows, it was always the most amazing thing. And you always walked away inspired and energized and full of ideas. But then you have to wait to the next one. And you go back home and do what you could do in your center or your community or your area. But the digital has allowed us to expand that in ways that we could have never thought of before. So, and the worst thing for the colonial enterprise is when we're collective. It's the absolute worst thing, because I speak of the colonial enterprise as not individuals, but as a worldview, as a way of domination, as a system. So it hates that, because that challenges its supremacy. And, the more we can do that, the more we can challenge that supremacy, but also offer alternatives, which is the other thing that's really important. And how do we bring people along, not just our people, but all the people who share this land and all the lands now, fully acknowledging that, this land, that we now call Canada, is Indigenous land, but it is now shared by a multitude of people from multitudes of communities, from multitudes of art histories. And how do we, instead of trying to replace the colonial with one other thing, how do we say, no, this is now, we are in a different place now. And we must understand that this is Indigenous land, that the art and culture that grew from this land is Indigenous. Absolutely. But does it now share space? Does it now work with, intertwine with these other art histories, with these other art movements, with these other long-standing cultural traditions and realities? And can we do that in a different way? So I think that's kind of where we're at now.
Kind of reminds me of how prior to contact, all of our nations, we were more egalitarian. And it wasn't a matter of everybody has to be this or that. It was a matter of how we not just survived but thrived in harmony with each other. And well, not always harmony. I mean, God knows.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Being a Mohawk on Algonquin territory, I know that.
Hey, I spent 7 years as an Algonquin on Mohawk territory.
That's true. That's true. But I mean, I think you're very right, though. I think, we always have to ground what we do in a contemporary sense in those traditions, in those, traditions of communal ownership, communal decision making, but also governance, legal frameworks. And people don't understand that there were very complex Indigenous legal frameworks that existed since time immemorial, before any contact, before colonization, governance models that were vastly different. I mean, the Ganyangahaga, or the Haudenosaunee, was probably the first democracy that existed on this planet. And, that these things were in existence. And yes, we are people and distinct nations that had also agendas that were economic and social and cultural and legal And yes, not to discount any of that, but there were, all of this activity was going on, and then, of course, we dismissed the idea of the savage, as the and again that perpetuated for how long that we were just running around in the forest. um, but the reality is there were complex systems that existed here before, and when we honor those and when we go back to those, and then when we bring them into our contemporary realities and our visions for the future, then we are maintaining that. And again, as you say, you know, we had to survive and thrive in order to get us here, because the attempt to eliminate us was very clear, absolutely clear, through actual physical violence and death, through the attempted elimination of our cultures, the attempted assimilation of our people through very brutal, violent means. Um, the residential school system being probably the most heinous manifestation of that, because that tried to do all of those things at the same time, took away our children, took away their languages, their cultures, beat them, assaulted them, murdered them, all in an attempt to eliminate us. We can't forget that. We can't be we can't become that because of our pain and because of what was done to us. But we must always remember it. And when we seek to move forward, that's when we have to go back to those governance frameworks, those legal frameworks, those kinship frameworks, those economic, diplomatic frameworks that we had, and chart a different kind of path.
It's interesting because some of the work that I've been doing, we talk about the wampum belts and the mnemonic devices, and the fact that our transference, our protocols for knowledge transference, was based on the oral tradition, and which is more imagery. The idea of this, I remember my grandmother telling stories, and you would just, it'll be like a movie in my head, and being able to, for me, that was one of the beauties of digital, was that we're able to capture that. There was a lot of controversy about whether or not we should be videotaping elders, but for me, I just felt that I would give anything to be able to see my grandmother again and to hear her teachings. And so if we can create something that can be passed on to the next generations, it helps with the revitalization. I mean, digital does everything. It's language, it's education, it's it's art, it's everything. I'm interested in your take on the on AI.
Well, a couple of things. One, I couldn't agree with you more, Monique. And I think one of the things that's really heartening to me, especially when it comes to new technologies and things that say didn't exist for our ancestors, and so you think, oh well, we got nothing. Um, but indeed, we do. We have those principles, and they exist in all our distinct nations. Might be different, but we have things that ground us, and those traditions that ground us. And so that we can say, no, even though this did not exist back in the day, we can still use those principles. And yeah, there are some that become very difficult. You bring up one that's very important. Do we record elders? And I think that's one that anybody who's doing that work, any artists who are doing that work, must approach very delicately and very much go back to our protocols. What are the protocols? So and the answer may be very different in one place to another, and acknowledging that. I mean, if we were in Ataroa, and it was Maori people, they would probably say absolutely not, because once that person has passed, we're not supposed to see their image. And if that is their reality, then, and that is their protocol, and that is their tradition, then that is it. There are other ways. We can take down stories. And it's why, Indigenous literature and that kind of documentary has also become so important. And look at the rise in Indigenous literature, where we can talk about things we couldn't talk about in other ways. So, there are a vast array, but understanding well that this idea of whose voice, whose story, who's telling it, who has the right to tell it, and who has the authority. And I think when we ground ourselves in that, then we can go into these very difficult situations and challenges and do it in a way that's proper. And that there still might be controversies, and that's okay, because this isn't about black and white, it's this way or that way. It's about saying, okay, given our traditions, given the relationships we have, wampum, as a series of, these are legal, manifestations. So they can tell us how to move forward on things. There are, traditions that go back, that inform how we can do this, protocols. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we have to always, if we ground ourselves in those, then we can move forward. And then we can answer those questions. And we can say, well, this is what I did. And that's why it's so important that we tell these stories when we have the right to tell these stories, because we can come from a place that says, this is where the authority comes from. This elder actually asked me, or, thought it was important to transfer this knowledge. I will respect that. And you might not agree with this, but you must respect it as well, because that's our tradition. And so I think those are some of the things. That's why I'm worried so much about AI, because AI does not ask for that agency or that authority or go through any of those protocols. It does not it doesn't acknowledge appropriation. It doesn't understand the right to your own stories, to your own people's life. It doesn't understand that. And it never, well, no, never say never. It doesn't now have any capacity for that. So I think what AI presents a lot of opportunities. I mean, Jason Lewis and the work he's done around this talks a lot about this in Indigenous futurisms and the potential of technologies to actually support our work towards self-determination and sovereignty. So I think that needs to be part of this. Again, it can't be a black and white. It can't be a yes or no situation. But I fear that given its current state, we've worked so hard to take this idea of narrative sovereignty, the rights to our own stories, the absolute rights to our own stories, and how that manifests. And we're now dealing with a platform, and for lack of a better word for it, that does not come from a place that's had to deal with this for hundreds of years. At least when we're dealing with, a colonial institution, it has people in it that can be allies or they can be resistors to us. But at least we know, and we can work with that. Something that you don't know, that you can't explain what hundreds of years of oppression means, and that can access stories in an unlimited capacity and do what whoever is directing it wants to do with those, that presents a real, potentially, just devastating alternative to what we've worked so hard for.
One of the projects that I worked on recently had to do with how algorithms, they are biased against Indigenous and BIPOC. And it has to do with algorithms are based on annotations, and annotations are based on definitions. But these definitions are created by Western society or Western thought. And there's millions of them, so you can't go running around trying to eliminate or change. I mean, take the word settler. Settler means something completely different to the mainstream than it does to the Indigenous community. And so there was a conversation I had with people who were saying, well, if we could create an enclave and we could create just this one, like a bay in the ocean of the internet, where it's all based on Indigenous culture, where the philosophy, the ways of knowing, the the cultural way that we have, that the commonalities we have amongst all the nations. Somebody even said that they wanted to teach at Cree and create a kokum. I was like, on the one hand, I was so intrigued, but on the other hand, I kind of got like, oh no. We had a conference a number of years ago, and two things came out of that. One was some things just don't go on the internet. They're sacred and they don't go on the internet. And the other thing was that we needed to protect, because, with the way that we transfer knowledge, every person is a walking library. And so if that person's knowledge is on the web, then it can easily become appropriated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it can even without AI. So we know the dangers.
And appropriated in a way that is completely outside the framework of the knowledge base, of the protocols, of the mnemonic devices, of everything. We all talk about how we have to be careful and what steps, we have to take. But really, to me, it's running amok.
Yeah, it's in its, phase, it's in its toddler phase. If we want to put some kind of analogy to it, uncontrollable, constantly asking questions, but not reasoning. It's just an information. Like, it's just, when toddlers ask all those questions, they don't want to, it's not about having a conversation or trying to reason a problem through. They're just a sponge. Like, they just want information. And what you feed in there is what will stay in there. And that we know, because if you fill the toddler brain full of things that are not true, for them, it is true, especially if you're the authority figure. So we have to remember now that, and this is me, I'm not an AI specialist in any way, but it's at that phase where it's all about information gathering. And the protocols used to do that, as you very rightly say, the algorithms, which control the flow of information to it, right, are based on supremacy, of certain of these ideas of supremacy, these ideas of importance and authority that don't take these things into consideration. So, on one hand, and again, there are people doing some fantastic work around this, and I'm always intrigued to hear them when they speak. So I'm not an expert on this. So, one of the things we have to do is, change the filters. So build the filters, build the funnel mechanism so that there are ways to make sure that the information that is being fed is appropriate, is contextualized, is, as AI becomes more, generative AI starts to get into the problem solving phase, which kind of come after the, toddler, where it's like, oh, okay, what information do I have that will actually allow me to make decisions? Because that's the difference between generative AI and everything we've known before. Everything we've known before was a database, basically, that we would extract the information that we wanted, but it didn't make decisions for us. That's oversimplifying and generalizing. But now we have something that will be actively looking for information to inform its decision making, because it's now creating. That's what generative AI is about. It makes things that weren't there before. It doesn't just synthesize information. It takes that and it creates. And so this is where, and there are the two tacks around this. One is about those people who are actively creating those mechanisms, and we need to be in that, and we are, but not as many as we would like, and that's a whole other thing. And the other is that how can we as consumers, as information providers, make sure that information isn't going to be used in this way, and that's very difficult. So, so much is already out there, but it is incumbent also on the people who hold right now all that content to put some limitations on it. So how the information is being and the mechanism for decision making at the AI level? And then how can we protect content from that? And I don't know I wish I knew the answers, because this is the big question for everybody right now. Like, the government they just announced today a new AI international, all these countries have agreed to create these research hubs on how to control AI, basically, and Canada's just announced ours. So those are, uh, because I think there is an existential threat implicit in this, and I'm just paraphrasing what I'm hearing, sort of these AI, theoreticians and experts are saying. I try to understand why it is an existential threat. I'm starting to, and I think you've raised some very important points around that. But for us specifically, as Indigenous cultural creators, interpreters, and storytellers, there is an absolute danger that all that work of creating a space for Indigenous authority, agency, and self-determination could be wiped out by AI.
Well, when you look at digital sovereignty
Yeah.
of our information, of our knowledge, of everything that's online, I mean, it's so easy to see how that could be taken and monetized, and
Oh,
has been.
it has been. But this would be on a scale that we've never seen the likes of.
And it's often, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but for me, it's often done by people who don't really understand the culture, but claim to be a part of it
Yeah.
and aren't.
Or have claims over it, which is this wider, we hear this all the time. It's like, oh, the melding of culture, there's a long history of that. And there is no such thing as cultural sovereignty, that it belongs to everybody. Everybody's culture belongs to everybody. As long as we, make sure that, we say that, and it was derived from here, but it's my creation, or it's, those are all buzzwords for saying, you know, you have no authority or control over these things, that doesn't exist anymore. And that's a certain movement as well. And because that's cultural and societal as well, as this idea that somehow, because we all share, space, then we must share cultures intimately, in the sense that people get to do what they want with them. And there's there's an undercurrent of that. And it comes out in very weird ways, but it does come out. And it's this idea of, oh, this is a hybrid thing. Oh, it's just, it's a fusion. I'm taking, I was inspired by this, or, and especially with the ability to now access it in ways that have not been there before. I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
But yeah, I mean, there are people who have uploaded ceremony,
Yep.
and then other people who take it and then sell it.
Yep.
It's sacred, it's ceremony.
Yeah.
And I mean, so much of our culture had been lost. To be able to have these, grains of knowledge of what was, somebody had carefully nurtured
Yeah.
throughout all of the laws that sought to kill our culture,
Yep.
only to see it on YouTube,
Yep.
and then,
Absolutely.
oh, come on to my sweat lodge, and we'll teach you how to do the goose dance. I'm wondering what you think about all these government organizations, school boards are now coming up with the idea of verification.
Of heritage.
Yeah, verification.
It's That's incredibly complex. I won't. I mean, it's such a huge topic. I think it's important that we make sure that and I mean we as Indigenous people, define indigeneity. I think it's important that I think that there are those people, and we know them, and this is a history there of people who would clearly fraudulently, um, take on the mantle, if you will, of indigeneity for their own gain. Um, what we can't do is knee-jerk reactions that just make simplistic criteria. The other thing we can't do, and obviously at the National Gallery of Canada, we're having this conversation. The Canada Council, we had it. Other it's, as you say, in academia, it's huge right now. I think there are ways to do this, which make sure that authority resides in Indigenous people. It is not, and I can't stress this enough. I stress it to my, when it comes up, by the board or whoever, we cannot be the arbiter. The colonial institution cannot be the arbiter of indigeneity. Can we devise mechanisms to better support Indigenous people while being as diligent as we can to uncover fraud? Yes. We must be extremely careful about doing that. We know the history of exclusionism, right? Like if you make rules that just say, okay, sorry, you don't have this, you don't count, or you're not part. We have a very complex history with 60 scoop residential schools, myriad things that make it incredibly challenging for some Indigenous people to have the kind of clear lines of sight, if you will. So we have to have something that is based, again, in our traditions, in our cultures, in our protocols, but also understanding that we cannot be the ones self-excluding, because that's, that harkens back to, camps, when certain people were deemed something or not something else. And so I think it's incredibly important for us to make sure that Indigenous identity is clear for those who would be in positions that are intrinsic to what we do. I've seen some of the models that are out there. There's some that are better than others, and I think we've all seen in the news, especially when these things happen, and I think there's some good ones. I think there's some good work done on how we establish ties of kinship, ties to land, ties to our own way of informing ourselves who we are and how that's done, or how we arrived at that. And so I think we can do diligence. What we cannot do is police, and I think that that's incredibly important, because there are nuances and gray zones. And will we ever establish a set criteria? No, because that would hearken to blood quantum and that kind of nonsense that has been attempted in other places. But can we create situations where people who have a clear sense of who they are, to identify that? Yes, I think we can do that. Will we ever completely have a model that perfectly determines? Absolutely not. We won't. But we can do better. We can do much, much better. But we must go to community for that.
I worked on all the ISO and on their eligibility criteria, and they took the same stance. We are not here to say who is Indigenous. We're putting together criteria to say how Indigenous people can access our funds. And so there was a lot of research done. A lot of people were interviewed, and the one thing that I found really almost, I don't know why I was surprised, but people were so generous. Everybody's got a cousin.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are so many reasons why people have become disconnected from the community,
Yep.
whether through the misogyny of the Indian Act, or whether, simply because they had to move away in order to, I wasn't raised on reserve, because if I had, I would have gone to residential school. So my family chose to raise the kids, my family in Toronto, because otherwise I would have gone. My brothers would have gone. And so there's so many reasons for the disconnect. And by saying, what came out of it was this idea of active, acknowledged members of community. And so again, putting the onus on the community to say, we know who we are.
Yeah. Who claims you?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a very, obviously it does harken to our traditions. Again, we have to go back to those. And yes, that's It's not simple. That's the thing. Like, sort of colonial institutions want simple. They want it's either this or this. That you'll never get that. If you accept that and then say, but what are our responsibilities and obligations to make sure that we are making our best efforts to do that and to allow for a myriad of different ways, then when we get involved community, then we can get to some places.
Do you think there'll come a time, moving forward, our sector is so young and there's so many directions it could go in. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts, your final thoughts about where you think the Indigenous arts sector is going.
What's wonderful about sort of being old now, that's up to the next generation. And they're here now. They're working. I work with some of them, and you work with some of them, and they're here, and they will be the ones. I've been lucky enough, as I said, to have been at this quite a while and seen quite a lot. And I'm not going anywhere in a hurry, but it is up to that next generation, and they're going to push it places that you and I, you're much younger than I am, but didn't. But that's where the future is. That is the future. Is those generations that come after us. Hopefully, we've given them a place to stand. A firm place, but it's for them to take it. Where they need it to go, and in their own minds. I like to think, that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and that we, through our work, try to honor that, but also bring our own, thinking and the new realities to bear on that. So that's what I hope for those generations, is that they think that they have a firmer place to stand than they might have had previously, but that they also think that that's not enough, and they need to take it in different places or further, or however they determine that. And I'll be very excited to see how that plays out, because there are many battles to come, but there's also the potential and the possibility is literally limitless. And I'm excited that I've been part of it, and I'm excited that it has a very solid future in the people that are doing it now.
That's very reassuring. I hadn't thought of that. And I really like that. Yeah, it kind of takes the pressure off, doesn't it?
Yeah,
No, that's amazing. And the beauty is that there are so many more now.
the door it's not completely open, but it has opened.
Thank you very much, Kachimi Gwich, for being with us today. I really enjoy our conversation.
Nyawagoa so much, Monique. It was lovely talking to you, and thank you for that opportunity. And it was really, really nice speaking with you.
Thanks.